Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani, and welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism. It's my hope that the content on this channel will help you better understand this personality pattern and the way these patterns affect your life in numerous ways. By presenting content on a variety of issues, again, maybe you'll get it. I hope you do. So today we're going to be talking about sort of the science of narcissism and specifically be talking about these 5 core elements of something called D. I know it sounds all very James Bond and menacing, but this sort of dark personality, which is represented by just the letter D. This is part of a larger, long-term series of videos we're doing on the science of narcissism. I think it's absolutely essential that people understand the science behind narcissism and that I stay current on it, so we're always up to speed on what people are learning about it. Let's talk a little bit about this dark core of personality, or D. Now, the tough part about understanding narcissism is that it touches and is adjacent to other related personality patterns: psychopathy, sadism, paranoia, impulsivity, dysregulation, and all of these patterns raise clinical and interpersonal issues. It relates to a personality trait that has been called D. I liked it. It's like kind of foreboding, like an evil villain. And D, or the dark, which stands for the dark factor of personality. So now a lot of this research on D is attributed to Moshegan and colleagues who conceptualize D as a pattern which characterizes a person who pursues their material needs and their social needs, such as pleasure, at the expense of other people, and will justify their mistreatment of other people via contempt and dismissiveness and cruel disregard for other people. In other words, they treat people like shit for their own needs and pleasure and are able to rationalize treating them like that to themselves and other people by viewing the people they mistreat as being somehow below them. And even as I'm saying it, some of you are like, yep, sounds about right. This model of D is sort of elegant and simple. The original model of D focused on a 2-factor model: lack of empathy and selfishness. But in a recent paper, Bader and their colleagues at University in Germany decided to put D to the test. And they did a complex statistical analysis called a factor analysis. They wanted to see if those 2 factors, lack of empathy and selfishness, broke down further. A factor analysis is kind of like having a big bunch of kind of unorganized stuff in front of you, and then you run a statistic on it, and then you see how it all gets organized. Basically, the statistic figures out what concepts sort of relate or hang together and separate out from the others. It's like I said, it's like having a bunch of stuff and letting a statistic decide what stuff goes together into what drawer or cubicle together, okay? And then, based on the results of these factor analyses, how we know things hang together, we can build theories and measurements out of this. Well, these folks did this with D. They kind of tried to break it apart into its component parts. And they found 5 things that comprise this dark factor of personality. What are your guesses on what those 5 things are? Have fun with yourself. Drop it into the comments, or even make a note, or even pause this video for a minute to do that. And then you can see if you're right, because I'm about to tell you what those 5 things are. Let's see how much you know about dark personality. The analysis and the results they got was really kind of cool. It's almost like it was those nesting dolls, the matryoshkas. Each doll you open up, there's a new doll. So they started big with the big doll, right? With the general concept of D. Well, they initially took D and broke it into the original 2 parts of lack of empathy and selfishness. Now, most of us would agree that these things are dark. But using that factor analysis, they were able to break these 2 things down further. Okay? lack of empathy actually broke into two pieces: callousness and sadism. Selfishness went through a few steps, but ultimately broke into vindictiveness, narcissistic entitlement, and deceitfulness. So now you can look at your answers. What were those 5 things? Basically, D, the dark factor of personality, boils down to callousness, sadism, vindictiveness, narcissistic entitlement, and deceitfulness. In plainer talk, D, the dark factor of personality, is being cold, cruel, vindictive, entitled, and lying. Sounds like most narcissistic relationships, right? So here's the punchline is this: D is bad. It's bad for anyone who comes into contact with it. This collection of traits characterizes people who are willing to simply view people as disposable objects that exist solely for their needs and are able to justify the disposability of the people they encounter by writing them off as less than them and treating them with contemptuous dismissiveness. In essence, it supports the idea that people high in this D quality basically treat other human beings as trash. They use them up and they throw them out. Now, the authors of this study tested this model. They came to this final 5 traits by testing it in 3 large samples or groups of people representing respondents from nearly 100 countries. So there was a wide range of representation. But this idea of D, I like it. It's a good model. This dark trait model in one factor captures all the stuff that makes psychopathy, sociopathy, and narcissism so difficult and dangerous for the people who encounter those D people and for the world at large. There are some really interesting parts when we kind of go deeper into what these folks were doing here. For one thing, it is that lack of empathy boiled not just into cold callousness, but there is another element to lack of empathy they found, which is sort of reckless, almost intentional disregard. This tells us that lack of empathy is a bit more nuanced than we think. And this may explain why people sometimes have very different experiences of the low empathy they run into in narcissistic people. Some people will experience a lack of empathy with a narcissistic person that is just cold, aloof, indifferent, but they aren't going out of their way to harm them. But others run into a lack of empathy in a narcissistic person that seems downright sadistic. For example, a person in a divorce going out of their way to stick it to their partner as badly as possible. That's the sadism. Lack of empathy has more texture and nuance when we break it down this way. Selfishness is very similar. When we hear that word, selfishness, we often think of selfishness as it relates to narcissism as simply being an egocentricity. But these researchers are finding something quite different and more complex. That selfishness is actually about lying, revenge, and entitlement, or the assumption of special treatment, or that the rules do not apply to them. The selfishness of D appears to be a self-serving, I can say what I want, I will lie to get what I want, I can take what I want, and heaven help anyone who stops me from getting what I want. D relates to the work that we have seen on the dark triad and dark tetrad models. Over time, I do hope we transition away from a model of just pure narcissism and into these more nuanced but also far-reaching and umbrella models like D or the dark trait model and things like antagonism. It gives us a way to talk about these patterns more broadly. But at the end of the day, A dark and harmful personality style is a dark and harmful personality style, whatever you call it. My hope is that seeing the science of how these traits are much more nuanced than we think, the proverbial nesting dolls, as it were, can also give a sense of why people may have rather different experiences of some of these patterns, such as lack of empathy, as well as the confusion that exists between patterns like narcissism and psychopathy. It's the D stuff, all the stuff in this trait called D that hurts us. And doesn't get, and what I like about D is they're not spending all their time asking why. What is the origin of this? It's not about the why. D is about the what. Let me tell you this, D is not a very nice what. So I hope this sort of glimpse into the science sort of tells you how we can break these things down and what the science is finding about how this stuff hangs together. I share this with you because the science tells us this is all real. These are not the meanderings of what's happening in random therapy rooms or the stuff, the crazy stuff that comes out of my head. It's not that. It's really stuff that's grounded in science. What we've got to now do is get this to all of you so you can use this to address the patterns in your life, stop blaming yourself, and be able to move forward and recover. Thanks again.